Good evening. Welcome to the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. My name is Stephen Collis. I teach in the English department at SFU, and I am the interim director this year of the Institute for the Humanities. I just want to begin by acknowledging the unceded and never surrendered territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples on whose land we are gathered tonight, as ever, in Vancouver. The plan tonight is to have a discussion more than a talk. So there's not going to be an awful lot coming from the front out, and we're hoping that you'll engage with some ideas. And I know some of you are a little more familiar with our speaker's work and maybe have some things you want to ask and talk about. But we'll get started down here. Our speaker is Jason Moore. And Jason teaches world history and world ecology at Binghamton University, and is coordinator of the World Ecology Research Network. He is the author of several books, including, and as many of you may know, Capitalism in the Web of Life, a very important book from just a few years ago. The more recent book is History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which is co-authored with Raj Patel. And in some ways, that's the basis of the comments that Jason will be making tonight. I ordered the book online, and the audiobook showed up, a CD. And I don't have someone who plays CDs anymore. But I managed to read the introduction and conclusion, and Jason's generous and nice enough to bring me a copy. Jason will say a few words to get us started, and I'm going to start with a few questions for him to get it going. But my questions might more reach back to the previous book, to Capitalism in the Web of Life, although there's a real continuity. The newer book is in many ways an extension of the earlier book. But then very quickly, we'll open it out. And if people have comments or questions, by all means, jump in. But for now, I'll turn things over to Jason. So welcome, Jason.
All right. All right. It's always such a thrill to be here and to come to Canada and to meet such lively and dynamic activists and academics. So this book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, and if you're curious about it, you can go to my website and find the introduction. It's a nice long introduction, and you can get a sense of what we're trying to do. What we are trying to do is to find a way forward that brings together the insights of feminist, of anti-colonial and multiracial movements, of workers' movements, of environmental movements, and to bring the insights together into a new history of the modern world, which is, of course, a capitalist world. And for us, it is something that we call an ecology, a world ecology of power, capital, and nature, in which the endless accumulation of capital, endless economic growth, and particular forms of power, especially around race, gender, sexuality, and colonialism, and around particular projects to remap how we have come to see global warming and planetary crisis as all of us, instead of who is really responsible for it, that is, capitalists. We have this great and quaint phrase, anthropogenic global warming. We say, well, it's in fact capitalogenic, made by capital. So in this book and in this world ecology conversation, we're really looking to open up and unpack a lot of the fundamental questions of justice and emancipation and sustainability in the 20th century. So those are questions like, how do movements against oppression and for equality around gender and race, colonialism, we can think of indigenous struggles, how do those play in with the classic questions of economic and social justice brought forth by socialist and labor movements? And how do all of those, in turn, speak to the question of the environmental imaginary that we've had since 1968? That is, the sense of, well, we're all in this together. Well, we may be all in this together, but many of us, as we say in the book, are in steerage, not up there in first class. So This is a book that is really a project of rethinking power and capital and nature through multiple lenses and bringing them together in what we think is perhaps a generative way. That is, how do we understand that something like nature and something like society or civilization are not mere analytical lenses. They're not merely descriptions or innocent descriptions of the world, but they are, in fact, from the era of Columbus, projects to remake the world. One of the great achievements of early modern capitalism between the 15th and 18th centuries, as we show, was the expulsion not just of millions of human beings from their lands and their physical destruction, but also the expulsion of the vast majority of humans into a new realm, nature, with an uppercase N. So women, indigenous peoples, Africans, many other peoples were expelled from membership in humanity, in civilization, and put into another realm entirely, the realm of nature. We point out that if you've ever used or heard this term, it's now a bit old-fashioned, beyond the pale, as if to refer to somebody's behavior as kind of socially or morally unacceptable. You are in fact using an old colonial imagery of the pale, which was the colonial line of English power and civility, to use the language of the 16th century, beyond which were the wild Irish, the savage Irish, who could be exterminated at will. And if the Irish did not suffer the same fate as indigenous peoples in the Americas, they still experienced mass murder on a colossal scale. A third of the Irish population is killed or dies in the 1650s, for instance. That again happens 2 centuries later. So we point out that these ideas of civilization and nature are not just analytics. They're not innocent descriptions. They are fundamental projects of the modern world, of reorganizing people's lives, not just around class, not just around colonialism, but in ways we try to show in which race and gender are consistently binarized around either-or premises, white and not white, man, woman, empire, colony, civilized and savage, that dynamic. So we show that these are practical abstractions, real abstractions embedded in the actual environmental history of the modern world, in its forms of power, in its appearance of what is reasonable, what and just. So this is a way of pointing out that the old white man's burden civilizing mission is something that is there from the beginning in capitalism and is fundamental to coming to terms with the present planetary crisis. And that planetary crisis has to be understood in ways that go beyond the geophysical, but that root the geophysical in its geohistorical reality. That is, the state shift in the biosphere today is not only one of abrupt and irreversible changes in ecosystems across the planet, it is also with and within producing and a product of formations of power, of economic life, of modes of reproduction. It is a way today that the planetary system is sort of in and through and within capitalism, but also that the language that we use today to talk about planetary crisis, at least in critical circles, we point out that the climate crisis is about climate apartheid. We can or should be pointing out that it is about climate patriarchy. It is clearly about a climate class divide all at the same time, and that these have their roots in the formation of a geoculture and practice of organizing life and land and the imagination of whose lives counted and whose work counted and whose did not, beginning in the Columbian rupture of 1492. And so we tell this story. Each chapter in Seven Cheap Things begins with the story of Columbus. And Columbus was, not the kind of guy we want to hang out with. He would not fit in with this group at all. And so we tell a little story. Columbus was this fascinating figure, nevertheless, who brought together all of these storylines of race and care and the origins of industrial capitalist agriculture and of conquest all down the line. So in sum, what we're trying to do here is to open up a new imagination that goes beyond the orthodoxies, both of environmentalism, of Marxism, but also of other traditions, and really tries to look at the moment that we're in is not merely a moment of biophysical, biospheric state shift, that is an abrupt and irreversible change in the conditions of life on this planet, but also that this is a moment where a political and intellectual state shift is possible, where we can grasp modernity not just as a mode of production, but as a mode of thought, as a cultural formation, and find ways to move beyond that in a way that really speaks to long-standing questions of oppression, of the exploitation of labor by capital, and of sustainability in the best sense, not the garbage sense of that term. And so this is really a call for an ecology of hope against the ecology of catastrophe that we get from both radical and mainstream environmentalism. And with that, maybe we can open up.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. Maybe an easy place to begin is to ask you to say a little bit more about your rejection of the term Anthropocene, replacing that with the term Capitalism, and just to establish, in case anyone's not entirely familiar, the term Anthropocene is actually coming from geology. It's actually astrophysics and stratospheric science and geology, noting that we've entered a new geological era, an era in which human activity has impacted all life on the planet, all life systems on the planet. So changing air and ocean currents, thawing, melting ice caps, rising oceans, thawing permafrost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The entirety of the Earth's interlocked systems are being affected now very clearly by human activity. So that term's been posited from the scientific side of things, ultimately. And you're suggesting, and other people are suggesting too, that there's a bit of a problem with that term Anthropocene, which makes it sound like it's just a human problem, and it leaves us in a context where we're thinking from our separation as this exceptional, separate, specific species that has some particular role that allows us still to see the rest of the world as just that, the rest of the world. So that's part of it. The other part would be another related shift in language you use in your work, and that is a shift from a sense of what capitalism is doing to the planet, what capitalism is doing to nature, and shifting to language about what capitalism does with nature or through nature, or even in a weird way that I think creeps readers out sometimes, capitalism as nature. That is, capitalism, and well, here's a quote from Capitalism and the Web of Life: capitalism is a way of organizing nature, or as you say elsewhere, capitalism is a world ecology. Mm-hmm. So can you say a little bit more about why capitalism, not Anthropocene, and also what it really means to shift away from that kind of more oppositional sense of there's this external thing, capitalism, that's doing something to that other external thing, the world, but in fact that capitalism has in some ways swallowed the world, and that the world has become capitalism, however horrific that may seem.
Well, it's such a great question, and let me take these in reverse order. Sure. So the question is, how do we think through capitalism in the web of life? And people often ask me, well, why did you call it capitalism in the web of life? And I say, because if you call it capitalism in nature, people think they know what that means. And so we want to start with, well, the web of life, what do we mean by that? So at the beginning, we want to grasp the web of life in its extraordinary diversity, in its extraordinary life-making capacities, which is often, I think, forgotten or minimized in many of the quite righteous critiques of what capitalism does to nature. A lot of violent, horrible things. There's a long history of that, as we know. What we want to do, however, is to be able to see that when we posit capitalism versus nature, we are unconsciously, most of the time, replicating a much older antagonism of man and nature. Is humanity overwhelming the great forces of nature? Ask Will Steffen and his colleagues, the architects of the Anthropocene discourse. Man and nature, and yes, they did mean man and nature. It is the Anthropocene, as Kate Raworth points out, is a manthropocene, and we cannot make that point heavily enough. So so what happened was an older discourse of civilization and nature was adopted not universally but hegemonically in environmental thought after 1968. There's a longer history to this, and that is the kind of thinking that has created the crisis itself. Now, we all know in practice that there are natures that we like, if you're sitting in a traffic jam, and natures that we don't like. So if you're sitting in a traffic jam, that's not a nature that many of us would enjoy. On the other hand, if we're able to go out in the woods or have a nice picnic or whatever, that's a nice nature. But when we talk about and use the kinds of phrase, well, we're going to go out into nature, that affirms a nature that doesn't exist, and that's obvious. Okay, so we all know at this point in the 21st century that pristine nature is largely a myth. But the thing about myths is myths are myths because they have tremendous social power. So the great conceit of capitalism versus nature is that ultimately, if you dig down not too far, you have a view of pristine nature in there. Now, well, we know pristine nature is not really pristine. But isn't there something to that? There's nature that's more or less untouched, which may be, but that's not the thrust of the argument. The argument is to reproduce a notion of nature as untouched by humans. So we need to go back, especially living on this continent, North America. Where do we really get that view? And where we get it is out of the process of invasion and colonialism and genocide. Of course, somebody like John Locke, who comes up in Seven Cheap Things, is the sort of archetype of this political theorist, in which indigenous peoples are magically redefined as not part of society because they don't have the faculties or the capacity or the civility to improve, to make nature productive. That is the responsibility of good English men with guns and ledgers and big boats that they can bring in shiploads of Africans from across the ocean. So we need to be very serious about not just the analytics, and sometimes people say to me, well, it's not just the analytics, and that's precisely the point, that nature and civilization, or nature and society, are projects of the modern world that are produced and reproduced at every single turn. So whenever you find the coming of empires and invasion and European power, you have almost overnight this redefinition of native peoples as lazy, as savage, as unruly, as in need of governance, in need of good, solid Christian education, all of these things. So there is a fundamental project in the making of the modern world that finds as its benchmark the policing of this line between who gets to be part of civilization and who is part of nature. And of course, there is a constant process of struggle and resistance around where that line will be placed. But that line always has to be drawn if we are talking about something called capitalism. So the argument is not that capitalism is totalizing, quite the opposite. And the arc of capitalism in the web of life leads to a conclusion that seems to be entirely missed by a number of critics, which is that capitalism produces forms of nature that are increasingly hostile to capitalist development, and which capitalist tools and rationality and science is increasingly less capable of fixing. Climate crisis is perhaps the most dramatic expression of this. So that the idea that capitalism is an ecology of itself is also to say that the capacity of capital, especially in the present moment, to deal with planetary crises is tremendously limited. Now, the other thing that I would underscore is that now, and this is a segue into the Anthropocene discussion, is that the end of the Holocene marks what climate scientists and climate historians always say about this 13,000 year stretch of time, that the Holocene was an era of unusual climate stability. This was an era of conditions unusually favorable to the development of settled agriculture in cities, what we usually call civilization, in a slightly different sense than the modern usage of the term. And one basic historical fact that we know about this 12,000 year stretch is that whenever the climate shifts in a major way, you have massive political and systemic crisis. So in the book that I'm now finishing, I tell the story of the crisis of Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, with the end of the Roman climate optimum and the end of the period of favorable climate to Roman political economy. Similarly, we tell the story in 7 Cheap Things about the crisis of the 14th century, the demise of feudalism, and the onset of the Little Ice Age. In the history of capitalism itself, it turns out that oftentimes climate shifts coincide with remarkable periods of political instability in the 17th century and at the end of the 18th century especially. So here's the punchline with that. The climate crisis today, climate change today, is likely to be an order of magnitude greater than any that we have seen over the past 12,000 years of the Holocene. So the lesson of the past 12,000 years is that climate change is always bad for ruling classes. So yes, this climate change is different, and I'm not saying we should be Pollyanna about it. However, we should, instead of fearing the collapse of ruling classes, a lot of times the people like Jared Diamond say, oh, it's a collapse of civilization. Not so fast. It's a collapse of ruling classes. And in the Roman West, once Roman power collapses in the late over the course of the 5th century, the standards of living for the vast majority in Western and Central Europe go up, considerably up. Social inequality is lower. Birth rate declines because gender equality is better. There's a whole lot of improvements in the living standards of the people who were living in Western Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries, even though the climate did indeed turn more inclement. So we have to keep all of this in a wider frame. And in terms of the Anthropocene, people often say, well, Moore doesn't like the Anthropocene. Well, that's not exactly right. Okay, so the Anthropocene is really at least 2 Anthropocenes. One is a geological argument. So the geologists, rightly, are looking for what geologists who do this kind of periodization work do. They look for the golden spikes, the stratigraphic signals in the Earth's record. And so we know now that we have a very pleasant, high-pitched noise here, don't we? Make it go away.
It's not,
oh, there we go. Now we're good. So as we tell in 7 Cheap Things, chicken bones, plastics, and nukes are the residues in the geological era that will be some archaeologist or future alien civilization will discover on this planet. That is the leftover of the modern world. All right, so that's one Anthropocene, and I totally embrace that. That's the geological Anthropocene. But inevitably, the people who study the geological Anthropocene are drawn into a very different kind of Anthropocene, which is what I call the popular Anthropocene. And this is a conversation that is really fundamentally about the origins of planetary crisis. When and where did planetary crisis really begin to set into motion? And it turns out that argument is much older, and it defaults to a view of the Industrial Revolution. It was Englishmen with steam power and coal that really made the modern industrial world, and then the world went to hell in a handbasket. And like any story, there are some very important elements of truth in that. However, when I and others say, well, it's not the Anthropocene, it's the Capitalocene, we're saying 2 things. One is about periodization, and we're saying, well, no, in fact, we can look at what happened in the world between 1450 and 1750, and we can see the most dramatic environment-making revolution in the history of humankind since the dawn of agriculture and the scale, speed, and scope of environment making between 1450 and 1750, and you didn't need a steam engine for any of it. But you did need technologies like the slave ship, and like modern racism, and like, as Silvia Federici shows, modern patriarchy, that is the creation of two entirely different zones of reality and power for men and women, and for civility and savagery, and black and not white, that these were in fact powerful forces of production and accumulation. And so when we say Capitalism, we're not just saying, oh, it's capitalism as an economic system. We're saying it's capitalism as a way of organizing life and thought and the web of life and humans within it. So to say capitalism is a way of organizing nature, we're not saying it in the old Promethean sense of, oh, society determines nature. Quite the contrary, we're using it in a co-evolutionary and co-productive sense, that capitalism makes the web of life, and we've seen this very clearly, but the web of life also makes capitalism, and we have to be aware of that constant churning of relationships, not just with the materiality of it all, but with the power and the ideas that are enabling the reproduction of this extraordinarily violent, but also extraordinarily dynamic system.
Good. There's like a lot of things we can pick up on and chew on, and I, probably people in the room are feeling that too, but maybe I can ask one more quick question, and then we can move in that direction, and that will be related to the idea of cheap things. It's in the title, and we haven't really touched on it yet, although it's obviously connected to everything you're just talking about. But in Capitalism, Web of Life, you have 4 cheap things. In the new book, we have 7 cheap things. But the short, and so they're expanding, which is troubling. But and it's troubling because the argument is, in fact, that capitalism relies on things it doesn't pay for. And you're drawing on numerous strands of thought to pull this together, some of which you've just named, through people like Federici. So clearly capitalism is dependent upon unpaid work by women outside of the factory, let's say. That's one source of cheapness. Capitalism does not pay for the real full price for the resources it draws from nature, nor does it ever pay for the waste it dumps back into nature, etc. So I mean, just to quickly remind people in case they aren't fully familiar with your argument, in Capitalism, Web of Life, though, the key 4 cheap things you name are labor, food, energy, and nature or resources.
Raw materials.
Raw materials, exactly. Now, in the new book, you've added money, care, and lives. And clearly part of your assessment of the crisis, the global crisis that capitalism is involved in, has to do with the fact that the cheap things are ceasing to be cheap. And I think especially that notion of cheap nature, and especially when you add the notion of waste, using the oceans, the atmosphere as sinks. The price the bill is coming due, as it were, very clearly. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the expansion of the 4 to 7 cheaps, and I think in particular by bringing in care and lives, cheap lives and cheap care. You are expanding your argument in terms especially of as you said a little while ago, projects that remake the world, that once we add care and lives, we're broadening the impact in our social sphere, I suppose.
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question, and so there are two different really ways of talking about cheap in between what I call the 4 cheaps here, and I say, I'm going to explain why they're not really 7 cheap things, but 7 is like a cool number. So we're going to tell you 7. 7. We got to use 7, right? It's Mickey Mantle's number. I don't know. No baseball fans here. Okay. So in Capitalism and the Web of Life, one of the moments of that book is a kind of conversation with political economy, especially Marxist, but not only Marxist political economy, in explaining how does capitalism deal with its recurrent accumulation crises? Because one of the things that I was consistently confronted with when I would speak with audiences is the claim, well, capitalism has always resolved its crises before, and it's going to do so today. Look at how powerful and resilient capitalism is. And I don't think capitalism is very resilient today for a lot of reasons, but one of them is reading the business pages and looking at the continued financial volatility in the post-2008 world economy. But what I needed to answer was this basic question: how had capital and empires, with science broadly conceived, with big hegemonic projects, really succeeded in organizing its way out of these recurrent big systemic accumulation crises? And so bear with me as I just give you the very short version of this sort of Capital One kind of moment, which is that a basic and fundamental condition for the revival of economic growth, of capital accumulation in every long era of development, was finding ways to expand the supply of labor, food, energy, and raw materials at the same time as reducing its price. And that's an enormously complex process, but it essentially comes down to empire and frontier making. You go to the frontier with guns, with a lot of power, and you find a way to overcome the local resistance and to restructure places like the American South, based on the expulsion and genocide of indigenous peoples, revive slavery, restore a system of cotton production so that you have cheap raw materials, cheap labor, on cheap land that is stolen, of course, and then you can proceed to revive capital accumulation on a world scale. All right, so we need to look at what's different in the world today. If you want to understand what's new, you have to look at historically how has capital overcome its crises. Well, it's gone to the frontier and found new and expanded sources of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials, the four cheaps. All right, so that's the basic argument there. It's an analytic for political economy. What was implicit here comes out more strongly in Seven Cheap Things, where we use seven cheap things as a kind of literary device. Our first is nature, and nature is not a cheap thing, but a strategy to make everything else cheap. That's one moment of it. But there's also the moment of cheapening, and we point out that cheapening has two major dimensions, if you will, and they're always deeply entangled with each other. One is cheapening in price. And price is the only way that capitalism can value anything. And with that is cheapening in the other meaning of that term, to treat with less respect, less dignity, to degrade in a cultural and moral sense. So to redefine women's work as not work because of the essential, this was the gender ideology then, and alas, too often now. This is, something that female bodies are naturally, notice the invocation of nature, naturally predisposed to doing, so it's not really work. And so we point out that there is a dynamic, this interlocked dynamic of cheapening in terms of price and in terms of dignity and respect that go hand in hand. So when we we add in chapters like care. Now, care is fundamentally one of capitalism's most indispensable forms of cheap work. All right? But if we fold it into the chapter on work, it gets lost in the shuffle because we are so used to thinking in the old sort of colonial binary mindset. So we wanted to break out of that. And then lives, of course, this is fundamental to our world today, and we see it with the resurgent neoliberal policing and militarization of borders, which is fundamentally about terror and about reasserting a kind of white supremacism, which has many usages. One of them is, of course, to cheapen labor in this double sense. So we talk a bit about borders, and we talk a bit about the cheapening of life. How is life cheapened in the modern world? Well, surely that's a dramatic and complex story, but one of them is by policing the boundary between civilization and nature. So if you are not in civilization, you are in nature. If you are in nature, you can be measured, you can be dispensed with, your labor power can be used up until you're dead. All of these things that we have come to know about the long and sordid tale of capitalism. So I think that's really what's happening between Web of Life and Cheap Things is an effort to open up this conversation around how the project of nature and what we call cheap nature is about all of the dynamics of oppression as fundamental to the dynamic of capital accumulation and economic growth. And that's so important because, of course, that's one of the huge divides in the 20th century left. And that's one of the huge analytical weaknesses of what is often called eco-socialism, where eco-socialists say it's capitalism versus nature. And you can see both in their pronouncements, but also in the way that they construct these stories, that race and gender are second-order problems to this capitalism versus nature. And we've seen a very difficult and tragic history of how well that has worked or not worked in the history of 20th century social movements. So how do we forge an analytic basis for a common engagement that isn't just papering over differences? And I think one of our key resources for an ecology of hope is to look at work. So the biotarian, all life works. Or is potential work for capital. There is an enormous and fundamental moment of capitalism that is the unpaid work, overwhelmingly of women, in social reproduction. And then there is the paid work of the modern proletariat, which is not all white, but is the imagery still is of like the English male factory worker in the late 19th century, or the Detroit auto assembly worker in the 20th century. And that pocket of wage labor and of the money economy is always much smaller than these broader relations of power that ensure, over the past 5 centuries, that huge volumes of unpaid work from the web of life as a whole, from women and colonies, in Maria Mies's phrase, are flowing into the vortex of capital accumulation and its dollar signs.
Excellent.